So I already made this video almost 10 years ago. It was one of the earliest reviews I made, and while I think many aspects of that video still hold up, there's a lot of information I left out. I only covered one of the hidden games, I didn't talk about the Japanese version, and overall it's just not as comprehensive as I think it should be. Also, the quality of the gameplay in that video isn't great. Actually, it's pretty awful. I think I captured it using component cables and a Halpage HD PVR. It was captured in progressive mode, so 480p, although the video is rendered at 720p without proper scaling, and it's 30 frames per second to boot. I know, yuck. So not only is the gameplay in this video going to be of a higher visual quality, but this is also going to be a much more detailed review. I'm going to talk about the Japanese release, I'm going to talk about what's still missing from this collection, I'm going to outline why it needs an update and what should be included, because there are plenty of versions of the Alpha and Zero games that have never seen a console or PC release. I'm going to talk about the secrets too. These collections have a ton of cheats and unlockables. I'm also going to look at the alternatives for playing these games in 2023. This is a great collection for PS2 owners, but it isn't necessarily the best method for playing the Alpha and Zero games, particularly if you want online multiplayer. Okay, let's start with the two versions of this collection and what's in them. The Street Fighter Alpha Anthology is the Western release, which includes the Alpha games, whereas the Japanese release, which is called Street Fighter Zero Fighters Generation, includes the Zero games. For those of you who don't know, these aren't simply the same game with a different title. There are numerous differences between the Alpha and Zero titles, such as balance changes, character rosters, and modes. The Alpha Anthology was released in June of 2006 for the PS2. This collection contains Street Fighter Alpha 1, Alpha 2, Alpha 2 Gold, Alpha 3, and Gem Fighter. It also contains two hidden unlockable games, Hyper Street Fighter Alpha and Street Fighter Alpha 3 Upper. Hyper Street Fighter Alpha and the version of Alpha 2 Gold found in this collection are exclusives too. With the exception of Alpha 2 Gold and Hyper Street Fighter Alpha, the games here are almost identical ports of the arcade games. This means that you won't find features like the World Tour mode from some of the home ports of Alpha 3. There are a couple of presentation differences as well, but I'll cover those later on. The Fighters Generation collection was actually released before the Alpha Anthology in May of 2006. The games included here are Street Fighter 0, 02, 02 Alpha, 03, and Pocket Fighter. It has 4 unlockable games, Street Fighter Alpha 2, 02 Dash, 03 Upper, and Hyper Street Fighter 0. This collection uses the same UI for selecting games, except that it uses the Japanese artwork. I think this is way better than the artwork used in the Western release, although it doesn't save it from being one of the most rudimentary interfaces ever. The Japanese version also has a moves list for each character in the pause menu, which the Alpha Anthology sadly doesn't. So the Japanese version actually includes more games and has a tiny bit more utility. Obviously, some of the menus are in Japanese as well as the dialogue in-game, but like most Capcom games of this era, a surprising amount of it is in English. Outside of these differences, both collections are pretty much the same. They share the same menu options, their performance is identical, and the process for unlocking secrets is unchanged. Now, I'm not going to cover every difference between every game. Some of these games, like Alpha 2, have so many versions that they'd require their own video to break it down properly. I actually did this for Alpha 2, and my head is still spinning. I did want to give a brief summary of each game across both collections, though, and talk about a couple of the more interesting ones in detail. So the original games, Alpha 1, 2 and 3 and 0, 1, 2 and 3, are ports of the original arcade games. All of the games include the following modes: Arcade, Versus, Training, Survival, and Dramatic Battle. The Dramatic Battle mode is the same one introduced in Street Fighter 02 Alpha that lets you choose whichever characters you like, and you can also have a CPU-controlled player too. Gem/Pocket Fighter is also a port of the arcade game, and it includes the same modes minus the Dramatic Battle. In Street Fighter Alpha and Zero, using a cheat, you can select the original Dramatic Battle mode, where you can only use Ken and Ryu to fight Bison. Also, you can swap between the original background music and the CP system music, which is based on the CPS1 version of the game. Yes, you heard that right, there was a CPS1 version of the game for the incredibly rare Capcom CPS changer, but that's a topic for a whole other video. Alpha 2 and 02 are probably the least interesting games when talking about hidden or extra things. Apart from the extra modes that the other games have, these are basically straightforward ports of the arcade originals. Street Fighter 02 Alpha is based on the original arcade version, so it includes all the additional characters that Alpha 2 had over 02, as well as new EX versions of Ryu, Ken, Chun-Li, Sagat, and Bison. It also changes how custom combos are performed and the amount of meter required to activate them. Street Fighter Alpha 2 Gold is the Western version of 02 Alpha. This version was first seen on the PS1 and the Sega Saturn, although the version in this collection has the dramatic battle mode from the arcade and allows you to use Cammy, first seen in X-Men vs Street Fighter in the arcade mode. Street Fighter 02 Dash is unlocked by beating the arcade mode of 02 Alpha, and it's the Zero equivalent of Alpha 2 Gold. Street Fighter Alpha and 03, being ports of the arcade games, include E Honda's stage as well as the original version of Saddam's stage. These had been previously censored from some of the earlier home releases. Street Fighter Alpha 3 Upper and 03 Upper can be unlocked by completing the arcade mode of Alpha 3 and 03 respectively. You don't even have to beat Bison, you just have to get up to him. These games appear to be based on the arcade releases, just based on the available modes and characters. It includes a handful of new characters. These aren't just palette swaps with different stats either, like the EX characters in 02 Alpha. They're completely new sprites. The new characters include DJ, T-Hawk, Fei Long and Guile. It also adds Balrog, Junie, Julie and Evil Ryu to the character select screen, and it gives them unique stories in the arcade mode. Gem/Pocket Fighter has a few interesting secrets, like a hidden survival mode and a color edit mode. It doesn't have an arranged mode with additional characters, but it does have the same hidden menus that let you modify certain properties, and I'm going to talk about cheats next. Finally, there's Hyper Street Fighter Alpha and Hyper Street Fighter Zero. They don't have an arcade mode or dramatic battle mode, they only have training and versus, and yes, you can set player 2 to CPU, which is something that I got wrong in my original review. Like Hyper Street Fighter 2, you can pick any version of any character from any game. It includes all the characters from Alpha 3 Upper, and it adds additional isms. It even has hidden Shadowloo isms that modify characters' properties so that they play like their counterparts from other games. So for example, there's a Street Fighter 3 ism that lets you parry, and it also adds new moves and animations. It unfortunately only has one stage. There are different colour variations of this stage, but it's still kind of boring. It would have been amazing if you could choose stages from every game and maybe even some of the crossover games. Sadly, outside of the huge number of character variations, it's otherwise quite bare bones, and it almost feels like a tech demo. If you have someone else to play it with though, it's wild and guaranteed to provide many hours of amusement. Okay, let's talk about the cheats. The number of cheats in this collection is frankly insane. I've stuck a link to GameFAQ's list in the description, which is pretty good, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's missing a bunch of stuff. Unlocking hidden games is incredibly straightforward. You just need to beat the arcade mode in the default games with any character. You can also turn the difficulty all the way down, turn the damage up, and make fights last one round if you want to make it easier. After beating the arcade mode, you'll get a message telling you which hidden game is unlocked and how to select it. The process is the same for almost every hidden game. You just select the default game in the menu, hold down select, and press a button. The process for unlocking Hyper Street Fighter Alpha and Zero is slightly different. For those games, you'll need to beat all of the default games and their secret games. Once this is done, select Street Fighter Alpha or Zero, hold select and press a button. Each game has its own cheats too, which I'm not going to cover here because there are just so many. I did want to mention the hidden menus for each game though. These let you customize each game even further, and these hidden menus have a long list of shit you can modify. To access these menus, simply hold R1 or R2 on the menu screen and press a button. R1 will give you Menu 1 with some basic dip switches, and R2 will give you Menu 2, which contains the more interesting options. This menu requires a guide because it uses a bizarre star system instead of labels, and I've dropped a link to a guide in the description. It's definitely worth spending some time with the guide because there are some really interesting options worth investigating. You can modify properties, like being able to build meter with whiffed grabs in Alpha 3. There are even some settings that change the presentation, such as adding in censored blood animations or displaying the original arcade title screens. So if you didn't like certain changes made to these games throughout the years, then there's probably an option to switch it back to the original. Generally, the ports of these games are good. They run without any slowdown or loading, apart from when you first boot up a game. They're also not missing any frames of animation or assets. If you have an official PS2 hard drive, you can even install the game to remove loading altogether. If you have a less authentic hard drive solution like me, then you'll see this screen. The main issue with the presentation of this collection is the resolution. If you're a purveyor of crispy pixels, then you'll have noticed that the visuals look a bit fuzzy. The reason for this is that the maximum resolution is 480p. In addition, the screen ratio doesn't match the arcade versions. If we compare this collection to the 30th anniversary collection, you can see that the PS2 versions of these games appear slightly narrower. Side by side, the difference isn't huge, and on their own the PS2 versions don't look horrible. When overlaid, however, it's obvious how much softer the image is and how much narrower everything looks. The 30th Anniversary Collection looks a bit darker too, although this could just be my component cables delivering a slightly washed out image. I've captured the game using a RetroTink 5X set to a 4x scale, so if you're not using a scaler, it will look a lot softer when viewed through a modern display. This is one of the key areas where I feel there's a strong argument for an updated version of this collection. An integer upscale of the original 240p resolution would be much more pleasing on modern displays. The 30th Anniversary Collection, which has proper scaling for example, looks really sharp. Input lag is an issue that seems to come up frequently in discussions about this collection. If there is lag, it's not huge, and I haven't noticed it. Maybe the games in the 30th Anniversary Collection feel a fraction more precise, but it's certainly not a massive difference. I'll be honest and say that I'm not at a level where a small amount of lag affects how I play. If you are someone who plays at a competitive level or covets frame data, then this is something to be aware of. So, bearing these limitations in mind, what improvements should Capcom make when they inevitably re-release this collection? Well, I think using the Fighting Collection as a template would be an obvious place to start. A UI that allows you to easily select any version of the 3 games, including both the Western and Japanese releases, should be the baseline. Including the same menu options and online system is a must too. Each game should have the following modes: Arcade, Versus, Training, Survival, Dramatic Battle, and Online Multiplayer with crossplay. Online would again operate like the Fighting Collection, letting you queue for multiple games at once. I'd like to take this a step further too, and add in either a server browser or some way to select your region. As for the games to include, here's my list. Street Fighter Alpha, Street Fighter Zero, Hyper Street Fighter Alpha, Hyper Street Fighter Zero, Street Fighter Alpha 2, Street Fighter Zero 2, Street Fighter Alpha 2 Gold, Street Fighter Zero 2 Alpha, Street Fighter Zero 2 Dash, Street Fighter Alpha 3, Street Fighter Zero 3, Street Fighter Alpha 3 Upper, Street Fighter Zero 3 Upper, Street Fighter Alpha 3 Max, and Street Fighter Zero 3 Double Upper. Alpha 3 Max, or Double Upper as it's known in Japan, is the biggest outlier here. This was only ever released on the PSP, so I think an updated version that looks and sounds closer to the arcade version of Upper would be great. Now, you probably noticed that I didn't include Pocket Fighter in my list. I don't have anything against it, in fact I really like it for what it is. It's not an Alpha game though, and I think the focus of this collection should be on the Alpha and Zero titles. Plus, 15 to 16 games in a collection is heaps. I think unlike the Alpha collection, all of these titles should be available to play straight away. There should definitely still be secrets though, and maybe the SNES port of Alpha 2 and even the CPS-1 version of the first Zero would be good candidates. I'd also like to see a gallery that includes all of the content from the Saturn version of Alpha 2. There's undoubtedly a ton of behind the scenes stuff that's never been seen before either, and I'd really like to see something like a documentary or a timeline that explains how the games got made. Basically, I want to see something along the lines of the gallery in the Samurai Showdown collection. I think this collection should act as both an accessible way to play these games and also as a way to preserve their history. So, in lieu of a modern version of this collection, what are your alternatives for playing these games? The Japanese version of the 30th Anniversary Collection isn't bad. It includes both the Japanese and Western releases of the original arcade games, although this means they're missing the characters, balance changes, modes, and secrets that would be added in later versions. It has a training mode and online play, but only for Alpha 3, which is a massive bummer. The PS1 ports are probably best avoided if you're looking for an authentic arcade experience. They're missing frames of animation, they have heaps of loading screens, and the port of Alpha 3 has some wonky AI. The Saturn ports, on the other hand, are pretty good. The port of Zero 3 in particular is generally considered to be one of the best available from a features and content standpoint. Finding affordable copies for the 32-bit machines can be challenging though, so you'll want to own a modded console. That leaves PC. Emulation and Fightcade are easily the most popular for playing online, and if that's important, I'd suggest looking into that option. Emulation is an excellent way to play the Saturn ports and arcade ROMs for an arcade-perfect or near-arcade-perfect experience.
It's showtime! Face it straight!
It's hard to believe that 17 years on, the Alpha Anthology and its Japanese release are still the most comprehensive collections of the Alpha and Zero games. Yeah, there are better options in terms of an arcade-perfect experience and online play, but this remains the premier collection when talking about the various updated versions. There's a very strong argument for this collection needing a modern update. The resolution doesn't look great on current flat screens, and the lack of online multiplayer and other options really stands out in 2023. Also, unless you have a modded PS2 or an original PS2 hard drive, you're going to have to deal with a couple of loading screens. Despite these issues though, it's still incredibly playable, and if you're an Alpha or Zero enthusiast, this is a must-own collection. If I had to pick, I'd take the Japanese Fighters Generation collection over the Alpha Anthology. It has the most games and features, and I think the game art in the menu is better too. Either way though, you really can't go wrong.